All right. Hey, welcome to History Chats this afternoon. Yeah, looks like everything's working. We're going to revisit a story that we've done, a new theme here. Gary's going to tell us about a neighborhood, and I'm going to just send it over to him, and he can take it from here. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, today we're starting a new series. Perhaps we'll see how this develops. But you may or not be familiar with something called Behind the Creek. It's a term that I'm growing up, I was sort of in this neighborhood, but it's sort of the story of a neighborhood. It's also the story, of course, of a creek. So perhaps the creek is more famous than the neighborhood itself, but I think that there's enough here for a little bit of a story, 15 or 20 minutes worth of a story with regard to the phrase of behind the creek. This perhaps should have been in parentheses or a little bit more of an emphasis with regard to the term itself. But let's visit this and see what we can find with regard to behind the creek. Oh, this is a map of Wausau in 1912. And I point this out because as far as neighborhoods go within the history of the city of Wausau, we have a variety, and this is just a little bit. But on the northwest side of Wausau, we have what's perhaps familiar to many of you, something called Parcherville. That's on the northwest side, pretty much north of Bridge Street into that, not as far as the Tech Institute, but up on the northwest side. Then going on the west side, coming south into the southwest side, south of Thomas, we have something called the Hollow. That was, in fact, I just heard that mentioned as a term the other day. So I know that that's still being referred to as a neighborhood in the city of Wausau. Then coming up to the east side, we have the Flats, which is an area south of, south of Forest Street, west of Grand Avenue, sort of down 4th Street, and you sort of get into something called the Flats. Then north of that is what some may call behind the creek. We don't know where that term came from. We don't know where the Hollow or the Flats term came from either, but that's part of the lore of neighborhoods in the city of Wausau. So behind the creek, that's we'll talk. This is where we will be talking this afternoon. A little something called behind the creek. So here we go. So this is a map, a bird's eye view of Wausau in the 1890s. So if you pretty much familiar Barker Stewart Island right there in the middle of the Wisconsin River. We'll narrow in on this a little bit. So if you're familiar today with regard to Wausau, Bridge Street, Bridge Street's still there. The bridge, some factories, not much going on around in this part of Wausau at that time. A little bit of development. We'll talk a little bit about that. Some scattered housing, but today, just to give you a little bit of a reference, today ABC Supply is a little south of the railroad tracks. This area pretty much in this area is what we'll be talking about as a neighborhood, and then also as a creek that's going to start to come through it. And that creek Stinchville Creek. I do not know where that name came from. He may have been here in the early days of the history of Wausau. We're not quite sure, but we're going to talk about the creek. This is the creek that starts on the east side of Wausau. Back in the 1800s, it was there. You can see DeKalb, Bridge Street, Bridge Street's there. Not much is happening, but the creek is there, a very big part of the city of the North End at that time. You can see Barker Stewart Island on the west part of the city in the middle of the river. So again, this is a little more growth, more development of the city. The maps showing in 1898, the maps are showing the creek as it comes further east, and again it takes that route around Bridge Street, coming south, and then eventually flowing into the Wisconsin River. So this part of the city of Wausau that is north, or what we may be calling behind the creek at that time, is what we're going to be talking about today. In the 1920s, you don't see the creek because the creek got filled in. A big culvert took that creek. We buried it underground. So here, no evidence of the creek, but we know it's there, and we will develop that, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So today, this is Stinchville Creek. It's east of Bridge Street, east of Tom Field. It's there. Just a little bit of a thing coming. This was just the other day. This is Stinchville Creek. It flows into that culvert that winds its way through this, like we showed you before, winds its way through the northern part of the city of Wausau, eventually into the Wisconsin River. So here it is again. This is how it's coming into the Wisconsin River and what we now call river life. It looks different, doesn't it? This is what modern engineering can do. The engineers decided that we wanted to make this quite a scene, so we can make Stinchville Creek look a little bit better than what it does when it starts to flow into that culvert, maybe a mile and a half away. So this is, you may know this scene. This is river life. This is the Stinchville Creek as it starts to come into the Wisconsin River. So this is sort of that history of that creek, Stinchville Creek. Here it is. So from here on, we're going to be talking a little bit about the neighborhood that lies to the north of that. But one of the things that we don't know about is really behind the creek, where that started. Like I said before, we don't know. But here in 1929, I just wanted to acknowledge that in an article in the paper, me and Hank think the Grant Giants baseball team are the most charitable group of softball players to the North Ends. Most likely there was a team called the North Ends at that time. We acknowledge that the boys from behind the creek are better than the Giants. Oh, well, so they're using that term just to identify this neighborhood and this part of the city of Wausau. So it has starts to have meaning, and it has meaning earlier, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But here in 1929, where we're using the word behind the creek to refer to this part of the city of Wausau. So as part of this neighborhood, I think it's important to emphasize what drew people here. So what's happening in the neighborhood? Well, one of the things that's happening is the development of industries in this neighborhood, and we'll talk about that. But before the trolley, before buses, before we had a great workers working along whatever factory there was along the Wisconsin River or wherever had to walk to work. So the factories that started to develop in this area started to attract workers, and these workers bought houses and walked to work. And some of the factories that included in this would be Marathon Box. On First Street, you can see the Bridge Street Bridge going over the Wisconsin River. I know this is I could not find a good picture of the Marathon Box, but this was a major employer of workers for many years. It is not there anymore, but it was a fairly significant factory on First Street. On Second Street and on Bridge Street, there for a very long time. One of those factories that attracted people into this neighborhood. Another factory up the river a little bit would be Lake Wausau Granite Company. This was one of the major granite companies in the city, along with Anderson Brothers and Johnson, and a variety of other granite companies that made eventually cemetery markers, monuments of a variety of using the red or rose granite mined in the towns of Texas and or Maine. So again, a factory along the Wisconsin River that attracted workers into this neighborhood. So what else was going on in this neighborhood? Well, we had a lot of a lot of things that started to attract people to this neighborhood, that started to bring people into this neighborhood. One of those would be Athletic Park. Athletic Park on Wausau Avenue, between 3rd and 5th Streets. Baseball, again, a lot of, since 1911 to this day, bringing people into this neighborhood. But it was more than just a home for baseball teams. It was also a home for the neighborhood. The neighborhood youngsters would come to Athletic Park and play baseball. This was perhaps their morning, noon, and evening entertainment, getting together the neighborhood kids and playing baseball and or football or whatever sport they were inclined to do that day. Athletic Park was that park that really was an anchor for the people of this area behind the creek. Another anchor, one of the other things that we have to have for this neighborhood was a grocery store, or in the early days they were called mercantile stores. This one is the Cushman mercantile store, merchant store. The building is still here, so you can go up on 3rd Street and on DeKalb Street and see it. That it's a basically it was billed as a department store, but it was it was also their local grocery. It was also their local neighborhood store where they could get basic essentials for the running of the household. So a very again one of those anchors of this neighborhood. And this was their story. This was their store. Young Hans Kuschman. This is a dated picture that ran in the Herald in 1988, but it still shows the quantity and the variety of things that local little department stores have to serve the neighborhood. And another part of any kind of a neighborhood would be a local tavern. This is the Glassette, basically a block off of behind the creek. Stinchfield Creek runs a little bit to the north of the Glassette, but this was a landmark and continues to be a landmark on the north side amongst many other taverns and saloons. Some are still there, of course, but again, serving that neighborhood with a beer or whatever, that one of the anchors of this area, this neighborhood north of the creek. Another part that becomes essential to any kind of a neighborhood, I believe, would be the establishment of local churches. One of the early churches that established itself in this neighborhood was Salem Lutheran Church. It was located, just for reference, on Bridge Street in the 600 block of 6th Street. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But of course, Salem built a new church to the north up on 6th Street, and they're no longer on this site. But again, an establishment of an early church for serving the neighborhood. It was quite important, I think, that the neighborhood and the local neighborhoods would eventually start their local churches. Eventually, they would grow, and what happened with Salem was that they would have to build a larger church north of 6th Street. And another church that was started in this neighborhood was St. Michael's Catholic Church on 6th Street. Again, starting in the late 1800s, a Polish congregation, the Polish people coming into the city, into this neighborhood, perhaps even on the east, on the whole of the east side, really, the Polish people needed a church where they could speak their language, raise their young people in the Polish language, and St. Michael's Catholic Church on 6th Street was that. It's up on Stark Street. Of course, this church is no longer there. St. Michael's has a new church, a new structure built quite a few years ago now. But again, a symbol of the early settlers coming in, deciding that they need a church to worship, and St. Michael's and Salem were two of those churches in this neighborhood that served that need. And this is a little bit of an article back in 1903. It demonstrates a couple different things, but it is reported that a petition signed by citizens in the north part of town will be handed in the next meeting of the council, most likely the city council, asking that action be taken soon in providing for the building and equipment of a fire engine house in that part of town. That section lying in Parcherville, which we had mentioned before, that's on the west side of Wausau, and behind the creek. So they're referring to the neighborhood as behind the creek, is now far removed from the city's engine houses as to make the building of one in that section practical. Well, eventually, so then on the corner of 8th Street and Bridge Street, firehouse number 3 was built, I believe, around 1911. So after it took a little bit, but then we have a new firehouse on that corner. This one was raised, and a new firehouse on that site is there today. But just so that you know, that on the Parcherville there was engine house number 2 on the, really not quite up in Parcherville, but in the center of the west side. There was engine house number 2. So again, the need, the neighborhood growing, the need for a firehouse is being established, the growing part of this neighborhood. And by the way, they're identifying it as behind the creek. So in addition to the firehouses, the grocery stores, one of the other major items that we found that we needed was the would be the school. So the schoolhouse, and the schoolhouse that dominated this neighborhood for many years, 50 to 60 years, and still Franklin School is still there. But this building on Bridge Street, across the street from what we now know as Franklin School on Bridge Street, this was in the early days, 1890s. This school was built to serve the residents of this growing neighborhood, and eventually the Franklin School had to be added onto for many years, and serving the children of this part of the city for like I said, for many, many years. A noted story with regard to the tunnel being built in the 1930s so that the children could go in the tunnel and out to play in the playground across the street. That playground eventually now houses the Franklin School. But later on, in 1970, the Herald, coming again to refer to this as the school behind the creek, is finally coming down, referring to the fact that the school district would be tearing this schoolhouse down and building a new one on that playground. So again, behind the creek, still being used as an area of the city of Wausau on the northeast side. So what I did, I didn't mean to jump around. I show this map just sort of as a reference to where we were speaking. I don't want to show a map at every site. So if you sort of get a sense of the Lake Wausau Granite Marathon box, I just wanted to give you some kind of a reference to where these buildings were or continue to, maybe to even continue to be in the history of, and if you see on the far right-hand side, you can start to see that the creek coming, that little stream, that little creek coming into the city of Wausau. But in researching this area, one of the terms that came into my vocabulary just lately was ruffians. I don't know why. I think that this comes to a story that Judge Louis Marchetti, said that if you live behind the creek, your fine is doubled because you live behind the creeks. With evidently the folks in this neighborhood sort of had a little bit of a reputation, maybe. This in 1904, 5 boys were arrested Friday morning upon complaint of a resident living behind the creek whose windows they had broken by throwing stones at the house. Well, then it goes on to talk about the fines and all. But again, this area behind the creek we're not sure how this started, but again, we see another example of Saturday night a free-for-all fight ensued in one of the saloons behind the creek, which resulted in one of the participants, and then it went on to talk about the court and the offenses. But again, somehow this area behind the creek got this kind of a reputation, and there are many more of these little stories that point to maybe the ruffians north side of Wausau behind the creek. I know this is, but this was written in 1918 to the Kaiser, and he talks, and it's supposed to be in German. Well, it is in German. Let me kind of broken German, but he's referring to evidently the person who wrote this was from behind the creek, because he talks about in Wausau his behind the creek. So you can maybe take a look at this as, again, as a frame of reference of a locality in the city of Wausau that has its own meaning even in 1918. So a lot of history, a lot of people associated with this neighborhood. Today, this is Stinchfield Creek, and the neighborhood that still is above it, still as the creek now flows into Riverside, into River Life and the park and the Wisconsin River. So a little bit of a story of a neighborhood called Behind the Creek. Maybe I think it sort of demonstrates the fact that a lot of different neighborhoods within the city of Wausau have a unique history. Parcherville, the Hollow, the Flats, all unique histories, all unique stories that I think contribute, that sort of makes Wausau unusual in a way, but yet contributes to the whole story of the people and the factories and the schools and the churches of the city of Wausau. So I hope this helped you a little bit. If you hear the term Behind the Creek, you sort of get a sense of where we were and where it was, a little bit of Stinchfield Creek. And you notice that I pronounce it two ways, that I do that because I'm not sure which pronunciation is right, but at least get a sense of the neighborhood, and maybe which may lead us into more histories of neighborhoods in the city of Wausau into the future. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ben.
Yeah, cool. One just quick question, and I was fiddling with something. I'll apologize. I, for some reason, misinterpreted this, and so I was using the term "beyond the creek," which is not the phrase. So I had scrambled to kind of change that at some point. Um, Essentially, beyond the creek, or behind the creek, was just as far north of Wausau, right? With the time that they were using that, it just kind of went, north of that. There wasn't like an end point.
Well, at that point, there was no, but neighborhoods developed after that. Forest Park.
Sure.
I think in today's geography, perhaps up to Forest Park, up to about Brown Street, up to baseball, up to Athletic Park in that area.
Sure. Just to clarify, because I mean, today you think there's a lot more neighborhoods, there's a lot more houses, up that direction. Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I hadn't heard of this either until you were like, "Hey, let's do Behind the Creek." So that's a very colorful. Not all of our neighborhoods necessarily, as far as we know, have that sort of colorful uh, phrase to go along with it. Um, yeah, so as Gary said, maybe we'll come back and talk about some other neighborhoods. By the way, if you're watching this and say, "Hey, there's a good story, you should do this neighborhood," let us know, because it's always interesting to see what people want, and it's a fun thing to do. Next week, though, we are going to be doing something a little different. Let me just, here we go. I'm going to do another peek inside, our new exhibit, Peek Inside, looking at some of the history and the collections that we have. I'm going to do another little video about, and I might change the title at this point before next week, but Knights and Cannons. Some interesting stuff there. I'll leave it to your imagination of what that might be talking about. But we'll do another video of that next week. So there's some good stuff coming up with that. I'm excited to. I haven't shot it or you know, I've started to kind of do the preliminary research, but there's some fun stories there. Yeah. With that, I think we'll call it. Thanks for watching. If you're still watching at this point, appreciate you. And we'll pick this up with more history next week. In the meantime, have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you next time for some more history.